Great. Good morning, everyone, and welcome everyone online. We have a nice group of people online, so and a nice group of people here in the Gompa. So let's go ahead and start today. Let's go ahead and start today with just the refuge and bodhicitta prayer. I think most of you are familiar with this, but this is essentially these two main thoughts that we use in Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism in particular, of finding refuge, safe direction, especially in the Buddhist teachings, and then also kind of putting forward that's this motivation of bodhicitta, the wish to become a Buddha, to benefit all beings. And we'll do a short meditation on that before we begin as well. So are you comfortable leading us in the prayers, Nancy? Thank you. Appreciate it.
Taking refuge and generating bodhicitta, once in English, twice in Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki chognam la, changchu bardu dagni kyabsu chi, dagi chunyen gepe sonam gi, drola penshir sangye drupar shog. Sangye chodang soki chognam la, changchu bardu dagni kyabsu chi, dagi chonyen gepe sonam gi, drola penshir sangye drupar shog.
Thank you, Nancy. So as I said, we'll start with just a short meditation. It's always nice to begin our classes, our time together, with some reflection and calming the mind, removing whatever distractions we might have. And so the first few minutes, we're going to do just a meditation on the breath. I think most of you have a technique you already use, and you can use that. If you're new to meditation and want some instruction, just essentially bring your awareness to this area around the tip of the nose. That's one way to work with the breath, where we feel the sensation of the air coming in as we inhale, going out as we exhale. And just try to stay focused on that sensation in that area. And of course, when the mind wanders, when you see that that's happened, get caught up in various thoughts of planning or remembering or whatever, then we simply let go of those thoughts and guide the mind back to the breath. So again, just find a comfortable meditation posture for doing this meditation, one where the back is somewhat upright and straight, but somewhat relaxed as well into this position. So again, we'll begin with just a few minutes of this meditation on the breath, and then I'll lead you in just a short reflection to set our motivation around today's topic. Now, to set our motivation for being here today, I want to invite you first to take a look at this topic of divisiveness in our world, particularly in this country, politically, even culturally, and just reflect on the way in which this has impacted you. It's important to start with ourselves, to see whatever pain, suffering we might be experiencing on the basis of this might be quite direct in our lives in terms of people we have become separated from in our families, in our communities. But it can also be the general way in which we feel this, kind of permeating our existence, kind of out there, a part of the fabric of society these days. So just take a couple of minutes to reflect on your own experience around this, really acknowledge your own pain, even the difficulty that you feel contending with the divisiveness in our world. And then to add to this, the recognition that it doesn't have to be this way. This is simply a product of various causes and conditions that have given rise to this divisiveness. And that at the very essence of every being is simply this wish to become happy, to avoid what is painful, what is causing them suffering. In this way, we are all alike. And so we can be here initially with the thought of how to address our own pain, our own difficulty in contending with divisiveness. But we do this so that we can benefit others, so that we can build the bridges we need to build between ourselves and those with whom we disagree. And really hold that motivation of being here to develop some skill and understanding around how to accomplish that. And then to encompass this within the greater goal to be a benefit to all beings, to help them to achieve their greatest potential, and to be dedicated to achieving our own potential, attaining Buddhahood so we can benefit others in the most perfect way, helping them all to be free from all suffering and attain the happiness, the bliss, the peace that they seek. Try to hold this motivation for our time together today. So the work that we do in this session becomes the cause for those results. And you can open your eyes fully and we'll begin. Please come on inside. We do have some room. There's some cushions on these chairs, but those can be taken off. Then there's plenty of chairs here. Please, yeah, join us. Good. Again, it's good to see all of you today. This is a little bit of a heavy topic. I don't know, these 4 Sundays that I've done in April, I started off with a bit heavier topic on working with fear, and we're going to touch on fear a little bit today as well. And then last week was all about making kindness your religion, a little more uplifting. And then this one's a little heavier. I tried to alternate them so we're not dealing with heavy stuff all the time. But obviously, this is something that is on the top of most of our minds around how to deal with a world that is so fractured these days. So I have put together a little bit of a talk, but I want you to know that I don't consider myself to be a professional in bridging with other people. I don't have much experience. I think most of us are a bit it's a bit insular, right? We're in a world that is our own little bubble. Santa Fe is very much its own little bubble. Perhaps some of you who are online in different parts of the country or the world are seeing things a little bit differently. But if we do have kind of that protected experience, oftentimes this leaves us with not a lot of ability or even opportunity to bridge the differences we have with others. But nonetheless, we all do have people in our lives, maybe living in other parts of the country, family members or friends, who are contending with what's going on. And so I think we have to have some skills and abilities around this. I did this talk initially just before the election in San Francisco when I was in the Bay Area doing some teachings and kind of threw together some points they had asked for something around this idea. And I'm increasing my knowledge about this by reading a lot of other books. There's a few books I'll reference. But again, I don't consider myself an expert, and perhaps some of you in the room have more expertise on this, and I'd really invite you to share that as part of today. So let me go ahead and put my little slideshow on. I've put something together for today that I hope will, again, give us some structure around how we're looking at this topic of bridging our differences. And I have a wonderful little photo there on the front that was the same photo I used back in October in San Francisco of kind of the two political camps. Again, this is where it's most noticeable, perhaps, in our world, but it's not to say that that's the only place where divisiveness occurs, obviously. I'm going to start with a little quote from Ken MacLeod. Ken MacLeod is a teacher of Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism in particular, who's been around quite a while, and I do admire him greatly. And these were his comments just after the 2016 election. All right, so we're talking about some time ago when we had our first presidency with Donald Trump and some of the feelings of divisiveness that were occurring already then. And his article was actually called "Forget About Being a Buddhist, Be a Human." He says, I think the best thing many of us can do is to use our skills to reach out and talk with those with whom we disagree. Bridges have to be built, not barricades. In order to resolve conflict and polarization, each party has to recognize the legitimacy of the vital interests of the other parties. Of course, looking back on this, these are the same sentiments in the same place where we're at now, and maybe perhaps exacerbated quite a bit by the activities of President Trump in his second term. But nonetheless, it's the same work we have to do. You cannot expect anyone to compromise on what is vitally important to them. Human connection is everything. Without it, society falls into Darwinian chaos. Remember in last week's class, I talked about this phrase that His Holiness the Dalai Lama in one of his teachings, he used this very simple sentence that kindness is society. We talked about kindness quite a bit last week. But essentially what we mean is that it's for people to be able to even cooperate in a society, there has to be an element of kindness, an element of concern for the other person, and a wish to extend oneself to be involved in the welfare of others. And of course, we've built society on this in our cultures since the beginning of time. There's always been a need to tend to others, to make sure that people are taken care of, that they're not neglected. And so again, this is part of the foundation of all of this work, is that we need to make sure that the needs of people, does it need to come a little closer? Okay. Oh, is it happening? Okay. Sometimes we have a problem with the sound online in particular, probably in the comp, it's okay. So this is an essential part of just having kind of a cooperative society, is that we have to be able to take care of each other, to tend to each other, to address each other's needs, to make sure that we're not just kind of living from a place of only concerned about our own welfare. Continuing with this, Ken MacLeod says, for me at least, Buddhism doesn't tell us how to address these issues per se. Buddhist practice can and does provide the tools to develop the intention, skills, and capacities to engage them. And this is one thing, again, I'm not going to be as grounded in Buddhism in a lot of what I'm saying today. I consider this to be a bit more of a secular talk. I'm going to bring in some understanding, obviously, from Buddhist principles, but it's also some things that have been developed in our secular world. For example, one thing I'll share is out of Greater Good, the organization that comes out of UC Berkeley. So there's a lot of tools that are out there that are really more directed at addressing some of the bridge building that needs to be done. But nonetheless, I do want to share some of the grounding in Buddhist practice for those of you who consider yourself Buddhist to know how that is an extension of what we do on the cushion and so on. And then he says next, but how we respond depends on many factors, including the circumstances of our lives. It is up to us to figure out how to respond to the challenges of the 2016 election, now the 2020 election, not as a Buddhist, but again, as a human being. I think we're really getting to these very fundamental human principles, which have to guide us at some level. And if it comes down to, of course, we're going to be dealing with this idea of course, two different views, two different camps. And oftentimes it's more than just two, right? Where we have a lot of divisiveness on the basis of different points of view. Nonetheless, you have to be able to settle on some sort of foundational things that are going to support the whole structure. Otherwise, it all falls apart, right? And that's, I think, what Ken MacLeod is saying, is that we have to come to some understanding that the basis of all of our action should be about creating the optimal situation for the welfare of all who are involved. That has to be the guiding principle behind it. If we get into too much of this, we're right, you're wrong, we matter, you don't, that's the sort of mentality that has got us into this situation and something that is not going to be helpful moving forward. So we do have to get to a place of some agreement on what is the foundation for living in this world, for having people in society, for being able to share a country, a city, a state, whatever the case might be. So I think we do have to get to some place of acknowledging those are the principles that we want to abide by and that we want to support in our world. So to go into this topic in more detail, I've divided today's talk up into, I think, 5 points. Yes, I was right. Why bridging is needed. Maybe this is too obvious, but nonetheless, I do think we need to look at the facts that are coming out and what we need to address in our world. I'm going to talk a little bit about this principle of equanimity that's definitely a part of our Buddhist practice, but I think it makes sense as a support, a foundation for bridging. And it's where a lot of this seeing everyone through an even mindedness, an equal regard, where that comes into play. Then this is drawn from the Greater Good Science Center using the 3 Cs, and those will kind of come into play. And then we'll look at some additional resources for bridge builders that are out there. And then I'll give a little bit of a conclusion. But the idea is I want to provide some tools. I want to provide some things that we can actually use. And I feel like Buddhism certainly offers a lot that's practical, but sometimes it does tend to be a little more philosophical. We have to make sure that we can actually use these principles in our daily life so we can actually make some progress in forming connections with others with whom we disagree. Hopefully, we have the courage and the ability to do that. So in terms of introducing this and getting kind of an understanding of why bridging is needed, this is some recent information that has come out, relatively recent. Despite common ground on many policy issues, a 2022 survey from the Pew Research Center showed that growing shares of both Democrats and Republicans view people from the other party as closed-minded, dishonest, immoral, and unintelligent. Now again, check ourselves. We're one of those parties, perhaps. Some of you may consider yourself independents or another party, but nonetheless, we all do fall into this tendency of seeing the other people that we are othering. We're going to talk about that in a moment, as having these lesser qualities, as not being quite as much. 80% of Democrats and Republicans feel coldly towards the other party, an increase of more than 20 percentage points from just 2 years earlier. This is information, by the way, from Bridging Differences at the Greater Good Science Center. Actually, I'm sorry, those 3 Cs may be from another organization, then hold on to that. We'll see it when it comes up later. Also, in the wake of the 2016 presidential election, 1 in 6 Americans ended a relationship with a friend or family member because of the election. And maybe that happened in 2020. I mean, some of you could probably speak to your own personal experiences of having lost friendships or family members to the election. One of the men who's involved with our interfaith organization, his brother was a staunch supporter of Trump. He was a staunch supporter of Kamala Harris, and they've been having a real tough time in their relationship since that election. 73% of Americans say Democrats and Republicans not only disagree on matters of opinion and policy, but can't even agree on the basic facts. This is part of the network of our uh, you know, political system right now too, is that we can't even agree on what is really true. What are the facts anymore? And this is the one that really got me. 15% of Republicans and 20% of Democrats say that the country would be better if large numbers of the opposing party just died. I mean, that's a pretty strong statement. And it's higher in the Democrats than the Republicans, which might be a little shocking for some of us who might be in that camp. But nonetheless, I mean, when I started looking at these statistics, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is really at a pretty extreme level already. And we need these tools for building bridges with others, for developing deeper understanding of who else is in the room, who else is in our country. Going back to that article from Emma Varvalokas in Right Speech, Left Speech, she says it seems Buddhist Americans are not immune to this trend. I say that without judgment, as I have been very much part of it. So those of you who do consider yourself Buddhist, maybe you do a little soul searching here and say, to what degree do you fall into these statistics? Statistics. To what degree do you agree with those sorts of mentalities? And to what degree do you further those types of mentalities in your everyday actions with others? And this is one of the things, being in a bit of a liberal bubble as we are here in Santa Fe, is that we tend to just keep bouncing the same ideas off of each other and exacerbating our own dedication to our side, our own commitment to being stuck in our own particular point of view and not willing to hear things that are outside of that. So we do have to be attentive to this and see to what degree are we playing a role in that. Maybe some of what we learned from today is simply to pull back from some of those behaviors that simply keep everything turning, keep everything moving in that direction. Nonetheless, there are things we can do to begin to understand and develop some connection with others. And that's a bit of what I want to go into now. A book that I just started reading, so I can't, say this is something that I've mastered by any means, but it's a book that I found out about through some of my interfaith work. It's called The Power of Bridging by John A. Powell. By the way, that's how he spells his name with lowercase. I just wanted to point that out so it's not being irreverent to him in any way. He breaks it down into these two patterns that we are involved in. The first one is the pattern of othering, which is a thought process, and then the breaking that occurs on the basis of those thoughts. And then goes into belonging, which of course is also a thought process, something that we introduce into our way of looking at our world. And then the bridging that we're going to be talking about today. And I found this really, really useful when I encountered this, because we do talk a lot about othering in our world, and all of us do othering to some degree. And get into the Buddhist perspective on that in a moment. But othering is seeing people, and this is how he describes it, seeing people not only as different, but as less deserving and not of equal divinity as us. Kind of, seeing people through the lens of being inferior in some way. And sometimes it can be on the basis of their political views, but sometimes it can be on the basis of their skin color, their race. It can be on the basis of their gender. It can be on the basis of a variety of factors, right? Because othering happens in so many dimensions in our world, in our country. Othering is the thought processes that feed into the behavior he calls breaking, which is essentially dividing, causing there to be separation between oneself and others. He describes this as othering in action, denying the full stories, the complexities, and even sometimes the humanity of those whom we consider other. So again, this is the pattern that is going on in our world, that is really um, reaching some pretty disastrous peaks in terms of the friction it's causing in our world, right? That people are tending to see other people through that lens, less deserving, their points of view not being as valid, what have you. And then they treat other people in that way of denying them in some way the rights that they are entitled to, just to be a member of society. So I like, again, that that's the behavior that he's contrasting what we're here to discuss today with. The othering and the breaking being contrasted with the sense of belonging, and then, of course, the bridging that we can build on the basis of that. So I'm going to go through just a little brief description of how he talks about that. This word belonging has gotten to be a pretty big word in our culture, and I want to talk about it a little bit after this, but the way he describes it once more is this thought process that's an aspiration and orientation in the world, which is essentially about agency for all members of society. There's this kind of bigger sphere of belonging. I know that belonging has gotten to be something that we are somewhat attributing some of the divisiveness to happening, is that people need a sense of belonging, a sense of we-ness, if you will, that has driven them to be in particular camps. And certainly this is happening with a lot of, I hate to point out the fact, but it's a lot of young white males in this country who feel disenfranchised and who feel that they need a place where they can belong. And so they've created a lot of these organizations, white supremacy, what have you, that are involved in various things that are not good for our society because they have that need for belonging. We're not talking about belonging at that level. We're talking about belonging in the sense of everyone being able to belong, to be seen as part of the whole, to be respected, to be therefore entitled to their own pursuit of life, liberty, whatever, that, be able to attain happiness. This is an important principle, again, that we have to see that everything needs to be based on in order for us to move forward, that we all belong, and that means everyone. Doesn't mean just, the people that we care about, the people who agree with us, the people who are friends with us. We have to find a way to see everyone as belonging. So that's the mindset, and I'll go a little bit more in this, but bridging, of course, is the behavior we're talking about today, which he calls here both a practice and a position. Just kind of interesting. Again, it is a practice in that we do have to be actively engaged with those bridging between ourselves and others and make sure that we aren't neglecting that. But it really is a position that we take in the world, that we are about bridge building as opposed to being about creating more separation, more breaks, more divisiveness in our world. Which, as I said just a few minutes ago, does come down to sometimes even just watching the way that we behave with others, that we behave with those who are of a similar mindset. And I do want to distinguish once more that we're not talking about accepting everything that anyone does, their behavior. His Holiness the Dalai Lama often emphasizes this idea that we need to separate the behavior of the person from the person. Belonging is all about the person. It's all about saying that these people belong. They are here. They are part of the network of society, part of what we have in our world. We have to see them from that point of view, that position. But we can still take issue with the actions they're doing by all means. This isn't a teaching in how to just become totally, neglect everything that anyone's doing and take no issue with, what people are engaged in. We often have to address the things going on in our world, but we do it from the place of belonging. That's why it's a position we take. When we care about the people who are engaged in those actions as well as the people who are being harmed by those actions. This is the Buddhist perspective, is that we can't have this concern that's only about one camp. And I love that it's being seen in these more secular writings like The Power of Bridging, where we have to understand that everyone belongs. Everyone is an equal object of our attention, concern, compassion, and so on. So I think this is, again, a position that we all need to take a look at, reflect on, and see to what degree are we helping that to happen through our own attitude of belonging and the bridging that we want to do to create more connection in our world, or whether we're part of the breaking and the othering that is the support for that. So I want to share a few more quotes from his book because I thought he was really very powerful. He says, "We live in a world full of fractures and one where polarization, division from one another, and isolating ourselves are becoming increasingly normalized. We live in a world where fear is often more visible than love or hope." This is a painful thing about our world to acknowledge, and I hope it wasn't too difficult for any of you doing the initial meditation to look at how you've been affected. We're all affected by what's going on in our world. We have to be okay with seeing that pain and acknowledging that that is where we are at. You are here. This is the world that we're living in. But it does not have to be that way, as I said earlier as well. In our effort to protect ourselves in what feels like a dystopian world, to close ourselves off from one another, we are likely to inflict even more pain and add fuel to the fire of the very world we want to avoid. This is my biggest concern, is that we are doing all these actions that kind of can reinforce the separateness as opposed to opening the doors to be able to embrace more inclusiveness. Now, this is a challenge for us in this world. And it's a challenge on all sides of the fence. Don't get me wrong. We're talking here within the context of each of us as individuals coming to this session to engage in this topic. But we have to do that investigation of, once more, to what degree am I creating more of the world I don't want to see? And to what degree am I creating the world that I ideally would like to see? A world where everyone is seeing that spirit of belonging and building bridges between each other so that we have at least some level of understanding. There always will be disagreement, without a doubt. I mean, this is human society, right? We're never going to get to a place where everyone agrees on everything that needs to happen, right? That's just not going to happen. But nonetheless, we can begin to see each other through this lens of belonging, through the lens of some equal regard for everyone. So this is the idea behind all of this that I think John Powell is emphasizing in his work with bridging. And it's the same thing that I think we see in Buddhism in terms of the teachings that we try to apply in our lives. So he then says, bridging invites us to listen for the other person's story, and particularly their suffering, but also their aspirations and dreams. You know, to what degree have we been neglectful in trying to hear that from the other party? And I have to admit myself, I probably have not done that as often as make my own assessments, my own judgments, and hold people in a particular view, and not been willing to engage in that type of dialogue. Bridging means we recognize that whatever is the key to the tension between us and the other is never the whole story. We are always more than our worst fears or worst acts. We yearn for our better angels and our best selves. There's that phrase, you know, the better angels of our nature. You know, at some level, this has to be a principle that we're also willing to put forward as part of the belonging, is that we trust at some level that people have those better angels. They might be kind of hard to see sometimes. I don't deny that when we look at particular people in our world, we might say that they don't have that, but we have to trust that it is there. Um, this is something I think that, again, really is an area that needs a lot of attention in our world, and we can be the starting point for it, each of us individually adopting this. I want to share here something that I came across in another book that I happen to have here, which I haven't read as much of, Cherished Belonging. One of the interfaith folks that I meet with mentioned this. This is a book by Father Gregory Boyle, who's a Jesuit priest. And he started this organization called Homeboy Industries. Perhaps you've heard of him doing work with the gang members in Los Angeles. I'll tell you a little bit more about him later, but I loved how he put this out there. And part of the organization he created of Homeboy Industries, they do bakeries and all sorts of things. He says two unwavering principles. And these are very Buddhist, I hate to say, but he's a Jesuit priest, so that we don't have a monopoly on these ideas by any means. First, we are all unshakably good, no exceptions. And two, we all belong to each other, no exceptions. I like these two principles because they're essentially talking about, initially in Buddhism, we often are referring to Buddha nature, which again, when I grew up in the Roman Catholic tradition, I'm not trying to put them down in any way. I maybe was absent the day they had that teaching, but I never heard this idea of us being fundamentally good. I got the message that I was fundamentally flawed. There was, you know, original sin and all this thing. If you grew up Catholic, you know some of these principles. It was like from the beginning, there was something wrong with me that I needed to look to Jesus, God, to help me to correct. Well, you know, Buddhism doesn't say that we're all perfect beings by any means, but Buddhism says that at our fundamental core is goodness. Is that's what resonates with our being. That is what we are when we remove all the garbage. Of course, the goal in Buddhist practice is to remove all the garbage so that that can shine forth, so we can be in touch with those basic elements of goodness, kindness, compassion, love, generosity, patience, all these wonderful things that are at the core of our being. You know, we're just often kind of armoring all of that, protecting all of that, doing everything we can to not be in touch with that, because this is the world we live in, right? It reinforces all these behaviors of us versus them, and really fighting all the way against everyone else trying to get our share of the pie or whatever. But if we have that understanding that people at their core are basically good, no exceptions, as they say in their principles, I think that's a pretty outrageous thought to begin with. Again, I don't think, again, we have it introduced here by Jesuit priests. So I know that this is a teaching that is there. It's just perhaps not given the attention in other spiritual traditions. But even in society, it's lacking, right? We tend to have a distrust of others, much more so than a recognition of their inner goodness. If we start from that place, that's a pretty amazing place to start. To kind of be at that even when we hear people again doing things and saying things that are contrary to that, we understand that at the core of their being is that root of goodness. The second principle that he talked about, of course, is this idea of we all belong to each other, this idea of belonging that I've already introduced. We are all part of this world, part of this country, part of this state, this city, what have you. We all belong at a very fundamental level. We've all got a sort of birthright of being here and a right to be here and do those things that we talk about, of course, in the Declaration of Independence, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, whatever. All of these things are kind of part of what it means to be in society with others. We have to see that we all do belong at some very fundamental level. And one of the things I may touch on a little bit later, she's one of my slides, one of the books I read right after the 2016 election was Strangers in Their Own Land by Arlie Russell Hochschild. She's a professor of sociology at UC Berkeley. She was doing research into why people, she kind of understood the liberal bubble, living in Berkeley and teaching at Berkeley. She understood what it's like to be in that bubble, but she couldn't understand the mindset of people on the other side of the fence. And so she decided to do a research project on this, and the book is a result of her research. And what she did is she went to Lake Charles County, Louisiana, very solid red district. And it happened to be a place where they had a number of these petrochemical companies that came in and did all of their nasty work and left behind so much pollution that the place became known as Cancer Alley because so many cancer cases were happening due to what was the residual pollution from these companies. And so she was trying to get an understanding. This is also where a lot of the Tea Party developed in those years just before the 2016 election. All of these people who were very fervent around supporting people who tended to be against protection of our environment, who were against the EPA and against all these standards of, you know, curtailing pollution and what have you. So it seemed like they're voting in their least best interest. They're not taking in their best interests into consideration when they vote, voting for people who actually induce more cancer in their families rather than, do something to curtail pollution, what have you, in our world. And her book I found it really quite interesting because what she essentially found is that these people had a sense of not belonging. I'm going to use those words. I'm not using Arlie's words, but nonetheless, this is the conclusion she came to. They were looking at the country they were living to, and they felt like strangers in their own land, hence the title. They really felt like they did not belong to the fabric of America because they had been neglected in so many ways. Their needs were not being met. They were not being paid attention to. And so, again, do we hear that story? Do we see them from the point of view of them belonging and needing that belonging and needing to be affirmed as people whose worth is acknowledged? I think this is something, again, we can all examine in our own lives and see to what degree have we maybe helped to create some of that division. And it's only going to get worse if we don't do something about it. This is my biggest concern, is that we all do have to take some ownership of the way in which we are co-creating the situation. So going back to that idea, these two things that Father Boyle says are really, the foundation of his organization and what he feels are really the foundation of a good society, to trust the inner goodness of beings, to see that that is what is at their core. And secondly, to really feel like we do all belong. We're all part of this world that we live in. And, we don't have to, create more division by excluding others, by having those thoughts of exclusion as well as actions that exclude them. So again, this is why this very first topic, why do we need to bridge? Why do we have to do this? I think this is an important part of it. What I want to touch on next is kind of the Buddhist understanding of this idea of belonging, of seeing everyone through an equal lens, which is this idea of equanimity, which I'm considering in today's talk to be really the foundation of bridging. If we're going to do this work, we do have to be able to get past the biases that we currently have. Now, equanimity, as it's more traditionally taught in Buddhism, we are looking at the fact that we have three groups that everyone is divided into. Everyone in our world, if we talk about all the beings in this world, they're in one of three categories for us. The first one, of course, are the people that we're close to, right? The friends, the people who we have some camaraderie with, who we appreciate in our lives. The whole distortion we have with them, though, is that we tend to get very attached to them doing that for us. And we look at those behaviors or those relationships often from the point of view of I scratch your back and you scratch mine. So we fall into this kind of pattern with them that's not so healthy. So that's kind of the distortion of those people in our lives. Then we have people who are strangers in our lives. And of course, the distortion we have there is we're really indifferent to their well being. That's a part of what these folks in Lake Charles County were feeling was, people not caring. People, they were talking in the book about many of them would make comments about how we'd bring people in from other countries and they get put at the front of the line. Whereas everybody who's been in this country and struggled so hard was being neglected and keeps getting pushed further and further back. Well, that's their valid experience, what they are experiencing. But as strangers, we're often just totally indifferent to their experience, what they're going through. You don't necessarily care or don't take any interest in that. The third group is, of course, the difficult people. And they're, of course, also a part of this bridging that we are trying to do. We want to bridge to the strangers, certainly, to understand more of what's going on for them. But is there a way to bridge to the people who are difficult people for us, who are challenging for us? That gets to be a really hard one because those are the people we tend to be in conflict with. And conflict, of course, and bridge building are the two opposing sides of the fence. Right? We have to be able to get past some of that. So we have a distorted attitude with them that has to do with our hatred, our anger, our frustration, what have you, our annoyance or irritation, whatever level it is, we see them in that particular light. This foundational practice of equanimity is being able to pull back some of those attitudes. It's not to say that we're through the force of this practice of equanimity that everyone becomes our friend. We still will have those delineations in terms of how people are behaving in our world, but changing our attitude towards them. I talked about equanimity as part of the four measurables when I did my teachings on that in February, I think it was. So again, we're bringing that up again, but it's an important principle for how we go about living our lives is having an ability to remove some of those distortions in regard to our relationships with those three camps of people. But again, in bridge building, it's particularly with those people who we are have that they're unknowns, or I think Pema Chodron calls them neutrals. They're people who they don't really do anything for us. They're not involved in our lives, so we don't really care about them so much. And then, of course, the difficult people, the challenging people. Is it possible to build bridges with them? So I want to point out some of the things that really reinforce the ability to have that even-mindedness, that equanimity, and remove some of those biases, which first of all is the one that I mentioned in the motivation tonight or today, that essentially all beings are the same in a very fundamental way. They simply want to be happy and don't want to suffer. And that's true for every one of these beings. And that's the foundation of belonging as well, is that we see everybody in the same boat, in the same predicament. We're all simply trying to attain some measure of happiness to avoid what is difficult and painful for us. Everyone is doing that. President Trump is doing that. People all around the world are doing that. People in Gaza are doing that. People in Israel are doing that. Everyone is trying to do that. Buddha would say a lot of people are pretty misguided about how to do that, but nonetheless, that's the starting point, is to be able to look at every being through that lens, seeing that there's no difference between those people I consider my friends, those people who are strangers to me, those people who are challenging people, enemies to me. They're all fundamentally the same. So the meditation on equanimity, the practice of that, is really initially to get in touch with some of that. Because I think that's really the best starting point in terms of a more secular approach to equanimity, is to understand that we're all the same in that fundamental way. There's no difference. Of course, we could even extend that to animals and other beings, and that Buddha teaches the idea is that there are that driving forces behind all existence, the wish to be happy, the wish to not suffer. But in terms of our human society that we're mainly focused on here today, let's start there as an understanding that we have towards others so that we begin to get rid of some of those problematic minds, especially the indifference to people who we don't know, and that animosity we have towards those who have harmed us or those who are doing things in our world that we disagree with. Disagree with what they're doing by all means, but don't do it with a mind of animosity. Do it with a mind that is concerned about the people who are being harmed, but also them as harmers. That's a much different scope of awareness that we can bring to our interactions with others, especially those who are harming us. So again, that's a foundational thought. The other thoughts that reinforce that are to understand that there is a changing nature to all of these roles. Some people move from being strangers to being friends. Some people move from being friends to being enemies and difficult people. That happens, unfortunately. Well, if we begin to understand that it's all like a huge rotating platform, beings going all over the place, well, then we don't have this hard and fast thing that we see somebody through that lens of that's exactly who they are. That's who they are in an inherent and eternal way. Rather, we see that it's all very flexible. Some of the stories I'm going to share later about some people who've done some of this bridge building are about people who've done that, who've actually sat down with people who are their enemies, and they've developed friendships on the basis of that. They've seen them in a very different light. So there is that impermanence to all of this, things changing constantly. So we can begin to undermine some of these distorted attitudes that we have on the basis of that reality, that there's nothing fixed in stone. There's nobody who's like an enemy to you all the time. They can be an enemy in a particular way, and we might be able to see some other side of them that leads them to be a friend. The third thing to keep in mind was brought up a little bit in one of the prior quotes I had, which is that people are in different relationships with other people. The person who's a difficult person for me might be your dearest friend or someone else's dearest friend, right? There's nothing static about that either. Nobody manifests in the same way to everybody on the planet. Even President Trump, I'll use him as an example. And again, I'm not, those of you who support Trump, I'm not in any way making any negative statements here about that. I'm using him as an example because he's very prominent in our world right now. He, is not seen in the same light by everybody in the world, right? And obviously, that's what we're talking about today is how do we bridge some of that difference when we understand that people on the other side of the fence have a very different point of view than we do. There's nothing fixed in that. You know, nobody's being seen in the same way by everybody. Even His Holiness the Dalai Lama, we might have this wonderful heart feeling around him, right? Because we see him in a particular light. He's not seen in that light by everybody in this world. People in China, Chinese government in particular, don't see the Dalai Lama as a favorable person. They see him as a thorn in their side, right? It's constantly bringing up things and trying to, you know, uh, have Tibet free from the government control and what have you to be the Tibetan autonomous region. These various things, movements that he's made on that front. That's the reality is that nobody is seen as that being that we have that relationship with them. They're not seen that way by everybody else. So these are the kind of the foundational thoughts that lead us to the sense of some sort of equanimity. And by equanimity, again, we mean an even-mindedness, an equal regard, a belonging, that we feel that everyone belongs, that we can be in some way have an equal concern for all beings, regardless of what camp they're in, regardless of how they're manifesting for us. So I've got one little quote I think I'm sharing on from John Powell, which again, he talks about this in terms of a different language, but I think it's getting at the same idea of an equanimity. He says, at a foundational, and I would say spiritual level, belonging also means that there is no other. Whose life is unimportant? Who does not matter? Show me the person not made of stardust, right? We're all made of stardust. Not only do we all count, but we're all connected. We all belong. And he points out that idea of connection, interconnectedness. This, of course, is another element of belonging, is that we recognize that we do depend upon others. Nobody lives their life entirely in isolation. We might like to think we're fairly self-sufficient. We use that word a lot, right? But we're not completely self-sufficient. We need others for everything we have in our lives, pretty much. We need to depend upon others for the food that we eat, for the clothes that we wear, for the cars that we drive, for the roads that we drive on. All of this depends upon others, right? Society is kindness. Kindness is society. And what His Holiness said. And I think this is an important part of it. So if we recognize also that interconnectedness we have with others, that reinforces the need for equanimity, for an even-mindedness, an equal regard for all beings, because we're all connected. We all are, belonging here. The traditional image, this is from Pema Chodron. I like a few of her comments on equanimity, and then we'll move on to the next topic. The traditional image for equanimity is a banquet to which everyone is invited. That means that everyone and everything without exception is on the guest list. It sounds hard for us to accept, but they're all invited. They're all going to be a part of that. Again, belonging, same theme, really equanimity and belonging very much fit together. Consider your worst enemy. Consider someone who would do you harm. Consider Pol Pot and Hitler and drug pushers hooking young people. Imagine inviting them to this feast. You can fill in the blank there, add whoever you want to add to the guest list. They're all invited, okay? That's what equanimity is about. We don't exclude anyone from that mind that is equally concerned. Training in equanimity is learning to open the door to all, welcoming all beings, inviting life to come visit. Of course, as certain guests arrive, we'll feel fear and aversion. Right? That does happen. That's one of the things I'm going to talk about in a minute, is getting into some of the things that we need to practice bridge building. It does take some courage. It does take some overcoming our fear to be able to cross the aisle, to go to someone else and really be genuinely interested in what they have to share in terms of their story, who they are, why they hold the values that they do, and so on. There's going to be some aversion. It's a lot easier to stay in our comfort zone, right? I've mentioned this a number of times here before, but one friend of mine, and I think this is a pretty common adage in our world, but he says he finds he never grows unless he's outside of his comfort zone. I think this is so true, right? Look at your own life. If you just sit in your own little bubble, in your own little home, in your own little community, own little world, and you never see anything outside of that, do you grow? And sometimes things are introduced just by reading or seeing things in the media, but we can do things in terms of inviting those people in. They're all really invited if we're going to do this practice wholeheartedly. We have to be willing to look at those folks and see, can we hold that same regard for them in spite of the views that they hold that are contrary to our own? So the fear will be there, but she says essentially we allow ourselves to open the door just a crack if that's all that we can presently do. And then we allow ourselves to shut the door when necessary. Cultivating equanimity is a work in progress. So I do want to emphasize that with people. We're not talking about switches that we can flip in our minds, right? This is not what our Buddhist practice is. This is not what any good practice of spirituality involves at all. We're talking about a gradual movement in terms of being able to change our minds a bit at a time with each encounter, with each person we bring into our meditation, with each idea that we introduce that's contrary to the way that we've been in the past. Each moment that we choose changing ourselves as opposed to staying stuck in the same patterns. So it's something that happens gradually. And we open the door to those difficult people a bit, kind of see who's there, maybe invite them in a little bit. And then if we need to close the door, we protect ourselves by closing the door. But we understand that that's not the final solution. You cannot solve the problems in your own mind, and much less in the world, by shutting the door to everything. It's just not going to happen. We have to be willing to open the door a bit. One thought I had, and I shared it with some of my interfaith friends after the 2016 election, was how wonderful it would be if we started hosting like these get-togethers, dinners, where people could come from different camps and just be with each other at the same table. Often eating together is one of those places that we find things softening up because we're willing to kind of be with another and sharing food together. So sharing their viewpoints and histories, stories, what have you, is an extension of that. I think we do have some of these opportunities that are out there, and certainly many, again, organizations that are trying to bridge the differences that we have in our society. But, we have to individually do that to what degree we can, kind of inviting it in a little bit. And if we need to close the door, we close the door. So I'm sorry, this is the organization that this is from. I forgot that. I found a number of these when I did the research for this talk back in October, that there's a number of these that have sprung up on the internet. Organizations that provide tools, training on how to go about bridge building. And this is an organization called Starts With Us. Greater Good Science Center does have its own program that I'll introduce you to briefly later, just in terms of giving you that information. And by the way, all of these slides I'll be putting in a file to give to Venerable Dundrup, who will put them on our website for this course. You just go to that session on the calendar and it will take you to the page, and the course materials will be there. They've condensed this into the 3 C's. And I like these 3 C's. I know that Ramos, who's here today, who I did the workshop on exploring nonviolence with yesterday, will appreciate the first one because it's the one that he is very much a proponent of and brings into our training that we do around exploring nonviolence, and that's curiosity. Compassion is something, of course, we talk about in almost every spiritual tradition. It's really the foundation of so many of our spiritual practices, especially in Buddhism. And then the last one that I alluded to earlier, courage. So I'm going to share a little bit on this from some different perspectives in terms of these three, but how important these are. And starting with curiosity. Curiosity starts with having some humility and asking, what can I learn from the other person? Being really interested in who they are. And again, it's not, I don't want to make it sound like it's egotistic and saying, what can I learn from the other person? It's really the other person we're focused on and really saying, what do they have to teach me? You know, Pema Chodron, who I mentioned a short while ago, she has this understanding around karma. I'm not going to get into a whole teaching on karma, but in Buddhism, karma is the principle by which we have various experiences. It means that anything we experience is something we've created in the past. So she uses the idea that karma is life giving you the lessons you need to learn. So if you come into every situation that you encounter, everything that's in your life as an opportunity to learn, to say, how can I grow from this? Well, that's a very different mindset to bring to those situations. It's curiosity. Like you're saying, what does this have to teach me? You know, what can I learn from this person whose views are very different than mine? How can I actually make this an opportunity to develop myself as well as to hopefully develop the other person to some degree, create an opportunity for them to begin to see something about ourselves, to extend themselves in a sense of curiosity about who we are. It involves respectfully asking questions that come from a desire to know the other person's thoughts and views, rather than a wish to persuade or change their views to ours. This is an important part of curiosity, right? Curiosity isn't a tool for us to get in there and change someone else. It's a genuine desire to know what that other person is thinking and their experiences, their stories, again. So much a part of this idea of belonging. We have to be interested enough to be able to hear that, to be able to acknowledge that that person has something of value that has happened in their life that has shaped who they are. So many times we like to pigeonhole people, right? Put them in a box and say, this is what they are. We already know their story. We already know why they're thinking what they're thinking. But do we? This is from a book on curiosity, Seek, How Curiosity Can Transform Your Life and Change the World. And it's a bit beyond just curiosity in the way that we're talking about it, but nonetheless, it's really an important skill that we need to have. At its deepest levels, curiosity has the power to do much more than give us informational anecdotes for cocktail hour. It can become a force for meaningful connection and transformation. If we're curious about the other person, then there's that bridge or more that we're building between ourselves and them. That's saying, inviting them in and saying, I'm curious about you and who you are. Tell me about yourself. And of course, having that willingness to listen. It can strengthen our relationships to ourselves and each other, helping us to better navigate disagreements, revive decades old marriages, or heal from past pain or trauma. Curiosity is a very important healing force in our world. And I think we've lost a lot of it in our world, where we once more are already making our judgments, our assessments of who people are on the basis of the sign they're holding or the hat they're wearing or whatever the case might be. And then we aren't curious beyond that, right? Because we've already figured them out. Okay. Curiosity at this depth invites us to ask questions that invite nuance and surprise. He uses some examples here that are not necessarily about a relationship with another, but rather than what should I do to make money, we ask ourselves, what makes me come alive in life? And that's a very different way of phrasing that question. That's a bit more curious. All right. Instead of, are you a Democrat or Republican? We ask ourselves, what values are important to you? It's getting at a deeper level of understanding that there's something underneath those labels. Democrat, Republican, Independent, Green Party, whatever, all the case, these different labels that we've given. And then he ends with, rather than asking where did my ancestors come from, we ask, how do I stay connected to them throughout my life? And these are broadening types of behaviors when we actually have this ability to see things in a bigger light, as opposed to just the tendency we have once more of labeling, judging, and then on the basis of that, shutting the door and not having that bridge. Curiosity also entails challenging our own assumptions about others and the biases that we hold. I think this is an important part of it. We are going to have those things flavoring our way of being in our world. They flavor every one of us. That's how we go about living our lives, is with our own particular assumptions and biases. talked about removing some of that with the mind of equanimity, but the idea here is that we have to be willing to challenge those. Is everything that you hold in terms of your own values and things that you live your life by, are those absolutely, without a doubt, undeniably true? Or is there some way to see some other points of view? I think this is really helpful. And in the workshop we did yesterday, one of the exercises is to have people give some assessment around what is a violent action versus what is a nonviolent action. What is okay to do, even though it might be violent, and what is not okay to do. We all have different opinions in regard to that. Some of us share the same opinions, but we have to be willing to say, oh, I'd like to hear, why do you feel that way? Why is it that you hold that particular viewpoint? And it helps us to challenge our own assumptions that we're living our lives by, not to where we become totally, unmoored and ungrounded and we don't know what to believe, but rather so that we begin to see that we're just a product of our particular own conditioning. Every one of us has been conditioned by the things that have led us to be here at this point in time in our lives. And that is something to be acknowledged. And sometimes that's been good, sometimes that's not been so good. Nonetheless, we're all products of that, and everyone we meet is a product of that. It's coming up as well in one of these comments that I've assembled here. It requires overcoming being fearful of the other person, as well as feeling too certain about our own position. So once more, not having the fear get in the way, but that genuine curiosity that is wanting to know, what is driving this person? What is it that they are thinking? I think that Arlie Russell Hochschild brought this into her research. She said she sat down at the table with many of these folks in Lake Charles County who were part of the Tea Party movement there, and she really got to understand their concerns and got to see their suffering and in their stories, who they were, what drives them to be in that particular camp. And it's heartbreaking when we begin to open our hearts to and our minds to the stories that people have to tell, because we're often blind to those initially, right? As I was saying earlier. Be a chance for some comments in a moment. I feel like I'm going blah, 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 blah. I do want to give an opportunity for others to talk. Beautiful and pleasing things naturally hold our attention, Oren J. Sofer says, but can you be curious about things you dislike? Try getting interested in boredom, back pain, or headaches. you know, do we have the same curiosity? We might be curious about something that we're really enticed by that brings us some pleasure, but can we be curious about the unpleasant things? True curiosity includes interest in what repels us: physical pain, conflict, psychological suffering, political difference, and unearned social or economic advantage. This type of interest nurtures empathy, insight, and skillful action. So that's why curiosity is on the list, in my understanding, is that it really is the tool by which, if we have that in a genuine way, we can get past some of that resistance we have to looking at political differences in particular, but also other ways that we might not normally invite something into our lives. And then he mentions one of the first books I read on nonviolence. Kazu Haga wrote a book called Healing Resistance. He says the author and nonviolence teacher Kazu Haga practices listening mindfully to podcasts and news media from the opposite side of the political spectrum as a way to strengthen empathy and non-reactivity. I mean, has anyone in the room done this? Has anyone in the room actually taken the time to watch the opposing sides, newscasts, podcasts, whatever? Good, good. Few of you, yeah. I mean, and it's eye-opening, right? Because you realize, again, that you're inviting in things that may not feel so comfortable, but it's with some sense of curiosity, hopefully, to say, okay, what is that about? Is there something I can learn from that? He says, to conclude this, to really hear the deeper needs of people with whom you disagree demands curiosity. It absolutely has to be there. Compassion, of course, I've talked about compassion almost every time I'm here. I talk about compassion, but it begins, of course, with some empathy. Empathy is the root of compassion, which imagines what it is like to be the other person, to walk in their shoes, and also to see their similarity to oneself. This compassion isn't about just compassion for them as something foreign to ourselves. It's seeing that shared humanity. It's seeing that they are a being just like us. got a little quote from His Holiness that kind of emphasizes that as the basis for compassion. Realizing that the other person is also just like me is the basis on which we can develop compassion, not only toward those around us, but also toward our enemy. And of course, that's a bit of what I discussed in terms of equanimity, but that's the underpinning of our compassion as well. We have an equanimity that sees them as just like us, and then we have the empathy that is willing to hear about their pain, to know about their pain, to wish for their pain to be removed. Normally, when we think about our enemy, His Holiness says, we think about harming him or her. Instead, try to remember that the enemy is also a human being, just like you. It's a really powerful little meditation that you might look up online. Maybe I could even send it through with the materials by Ram Das and Mirabai Bush, who lives up in Mirabai Bush. I'm not sure who that is. I'm thinking of Mirabai Star, who lives in Taos. But anyway, it's a meditation called Just Like Me. You kind of hold the other person, especially a difficult person, in your awareness, and you generate thoughts such as, this person has a body and mind just like me, has feelings, emotions, and thoughts just like me, where you really kind of try to break down some of that feeling of otherness. Also, compassion, of course, entails listening deeply to the other person, not just for understanding and learning facts about who they are, but also for emotions and feelings, as well as their values and beliefs. This is an important part of it, a more active listening. If you're going to be curious about somebody, well, then you bring this compassionate spirit to that interchange where you really want to understand and appreciate their experience, what they believe, what they feel, what their emotions are. And it also involves being able to see how others' views are dependent on their conditioning, just like our own views. This is what I mentioned earlier. His Holiness the Dalai Lama told a story once about how he witnessed, or I don't know if he witnessed it, the footage of it, I think, of a Chinese guard beating up a young Tibetan boy whose father had been very involved in the resistance. And so it was like the sins of the father kind of thing. They were inflicting all of this harm on this young boy because of what his father had done. And His Holiness said, my initial thought was, I was really angry that this was happening to this young boy. He said, but then I thought about interdependence and the conditioning that led to the soldier doing this to this young boy. It doesn't happen in isolation, right? Somebody becomes, they're born into that country. They have the particular propaganda that maybe is fed into them around who the Tibetan people are. They learn to uphold the state and the value of the state and see things as enemies of the state, as things they need to oppose. And so the conditioning that leads someone to inflict damage on another person, we're often blind to, right? It doesn't mean that that conditioning is good. It doesn't mean that their actions are good. But we have to understand that these things don't happen in isolation. So the compassion extends to even the whole kind of product of what we become on the basis of the conditioning that have led us to be who we are. But that's again not cast in stone. That's something that can be changed by different conditioning, right? We get exposed to different things and we have different things influencing us, and we find that suddenly we are more compassionate, kind, caring. The last thing is courage. Courage involves having bravery to engage with another who has a differing perspective and also to speak to your own point of view in their presence. Courage doesn't mean that I'm going to put myself in a position necessarily where all I'm going to do is get bombarded and, blasted by somebody else's point of view, but where we can have, hopefully, that curiosity about each other and a desire to get to know who each other is at our deepest level. That does take some courage, absolutely. I mean, this is what probably keeps most of us from doing that type of work, from bridging with others. Back to Aaron J. Sofer, and this is a really nice book. I've read most of this book. It's really quite special. He has a lot of these different qualities. It's called Your Heart Was Made for This, Contemplative Practices for Meeting a World in Crisis with Courage, Integrity, and Love. He says a great myth about courage is that it means not feeling afraid. I talked about this a bit in the Working with Fear 2 weeks ago. But in fact, far from being the absence of fear, courage is the willingness to be present and vulnerable, meeting what is happening with an open heart in spite of fear. It's that ability that we have, okay, I know I'm feeling fearful. I know I'm quite vulnerable and putting myself in this position, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to go forward with some determination to extend myself, to get out of my comfort zone, right? We're all very comfortable not having to be dealing with confrontation and conflict. But we need to occasionally get out of that zone. Courage requires wisdom and compassion, two primary Buddhist values. Wisdom offers understanding and perspective so that we don't freak out when things go haywire, right? You have to bring some wisdom into it. And compassion softens the heart so that we don't deny reality and pretend everything is okay. Courage also draws strength from self-compassion, which soothes us during difficult moments. So again, compassion, we often talk in Buddhism how it really does begin with ourselves, compassion for ourselves in our own situation. Then we can extend it to others. So these are the three that are really kind of central. Again, when we talk about how we build bridges with others, is having some curiosity about the person on the other side, some compassion for them, and a willingness to acknowledge the parts of them that are maybe not so easy to get our heads around and to really see. You know, everyone is a suffering being. And I sometimes say this, again, I've been using President Trump as an example, but I can't imagine what being in his mind for 1 minute would be like. I mean, really, the torment that he might be going through at any particular moment in time is probably pretty outrageous. This is the type of being that we can see manifesting in these actions in our world. The mindset that's behind it is probably equally disturbed. And that's a hard place to be, to open to that with some compassion, some wish for him and others who are like-minded to be free from that. And then, of course, the courage it takes to put oneself in that vulnerable position. Let me see if there are any comments. I've got a few other bits to share, but I feel like I've been talking so long and I probably need a drink of tea or something. But anyone have anything they'd like to share? In the Gompa here, we do have a microphone. Just put your hand up and Nancy will bring that over and we'll make sure that the folks online can hear that as well as it's in the recording. And there's a comment in the chat that I'll address. And then if anyone else had a comment, they can either put it in chat online or you can raise your hand. Yes, Leah.
Thank you, Gendon, for these teachings. Much needed. I do want to say this, though. I subscribe to a lot of online news, and I like reading it, and all different kinds. And I will say this, on some of the issues that are being proposed by maybe the other side, those news sources want you to click on their site, and some of the headlines, if you do a deeper dig, they're misleading. They're trying to create an emotional state. And I realized, you got to be careful. Even if these news sources say, we report only the facts and we don't make money. And if you dig deeper, it's emotional. They're trying to trigger our emotions and click on this story or that story.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for pointing that out, Lee. I think this is something we have to be aware of, is the degree to which there might be some manipulation of our opinions, our emotions, what have you, on the media and what we experience. Have to be careful. I mean, we really have to protect our minds to some degree and say, okay, what am I letting in? And do I have this lens that is only going to see everything that comes in as reinforcing some view of the truth that maybe is not correct, maybe is not even truth at all. So again, I think we do have to be very cautious in the role that media plays in our society. It's weird because you don't think that they have a vested interest in keeping divisiveness going, unless, I mean, the idea is that it sells more interest in their own, business. Beyond that, I mean, it's amazing that they're motivated in such a base way to incite those sorts of opinions. But we are being manipulated by the media to a large degree. Yes. Let me go to I'll get to you in a moment, Lorna, online, but there is a comment from Eli. I'm working on developing the practice and position of bridging and equanimity. I also see some value in peaceful protests, but I can't get past the feeling that participation in peaceful protests only fortifies an us and them position and mindset. This seems counterproductive to my practice and work on bridging. Can you speak to this a bit? I mean, I think there is that element to it, is that when we are putting forward an opposition to what is going on in our world through protest or what have you, that there is a feeling like others are being vilified, that we are putting through that us and them kind of mentality. I mean, I would hope that protests would begin to be formed that are more about bridge building, more about how do we bring people to a common understanding. as opposed to putting people down, doing things that are more negative, that create more division. It's not going to be helpful. So again, I myself, I have to admit, I've never been much of a protest person because I find myself too easily moving into the dimension of that kind of mentality where it's like suddenly, I'm screaming with everybody else or something. I'm not saying that all of our protests are about screaming, but it's a mentality that we bring into the protests. And if we're not careful, I think it can become a source of more division. So I don't tend to do that. It was interesting when we had the Women's March after the 2016 election, that was in 2017, the Saturday before the inauguration, right? And so they did one here, of course, in Santa Fe. And there was one member of our community who said, I think it would be really nice if we offered something that's a little more quiet and reflective as opposed to being out and protesting. So we offered a little meditation at the same time. I was happy to lead it because I didn't want to necessarily be in the protest. I don't know. That's just not, I find that I get too riled up in a sense when I'm in that kind of environment. So it was really quite sweet, to be able to do that. Maybe we each have to find our own way of kind of doing what we call protest, of doing what we, trying to make sure that once more the actions that we oppose are opposed because they are not good for the welfare of all, because they are not built on a spirit of belonging, but we don't the people who are doing those actions. It's a balancing act. I haven't perfected this by any means, and so once more, I'm not the professional in the room, just somebody who's trying to throw a few ideas for us to think about, out into the ethosphere or whatever, and try to see what people think about these ideas. But the idea is that I really do think that there's a need for us to be opposing what is not good for our world and for the beings in our world. Absolutely. And I think we all have to be very clear in that. That's the foundational thing I mentioned at the beginning that we have to adhere to and say, we are here with that aim of trying to create the optimal good, the optimal happiness and well-being for everyone in this world. And anything that opposes that is to be opposed. But the people who are engaged in that, again, vilifying them or too much of that us and them mentality, it is problematic. So I don't know, Eli, if I have a perfect answer for you in regard to how to balance that, because I do think that if we don't say and do things to oppose some of these actions, we're doing a grave disservice to those people who are affected by those actions, absolutely, as well as to ourselves as members of the human race and beings on this planet. So, yeah. Anyway, Lorna, if you wouldn't mind unmuting and sharing your question.
Yes. Thank you again, Don, for the teaching. This is great. Actually, one of the inspirations have run across over in the last few years, of course, besides the Dalai Lama and all the great Buddhist wisdom, is actually an African American fellow, and I can't remember what his name is, but I was watching a documentary on him, and he is somebody who one by one would get together with members of the Ku Klux Klan and engage in conversation with them. And just through his compassionate listening and trying to understand where they were coming from, he ended up by turning them away from their divisive ideology and way of viewing the world. And he had a whole closet full of robes that he had collected from every clan member that had been able to engage with and have them decide that they were going down the wrong path. And somebody there or online may know what his name is, but I was really inspired by him.
He's actually one of my upcoming slides, Daryl Davis.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, no, great example. I mean,
he's like the first example that came to mind for me in terms of courage. Daryl Davis, blues musician, and an anonymous Ku Klux Klan member next to him. I'll share his story. I mean, I think you've really told a wonderful his story already. Maybe I don't need to say much more. I'm going to share a few of his words, though, that came from an NPR interview that he did with All Things Considered. The best thing you do, he says, is you study up on the subject as much as you can. He says, I went in armed, not with a weapon, but with knowledge. I knew as much about the Klan, if not more, than many of the Klan people that I interviewed. When they see that you know about their organization, their belief system, they actually respect you. Whether they like you or not, they respect the fact that you've done your homework. Just like any good salesman, you want a return visit, and they recognize that I'd done my homework, which allowed me to come back again. That began to chip away at their ideology, because when two enemies are talking, they're not fighting. It's when the talking ceases that the ground becomes fertile for violence. If you spend 5 minutes with your worst enemy, it doesn't have to be about race, it could be about anything. You will find that you both have something in common. As you build upon those commonalities, you're forming a relationship. And as you build about that relationship, you're forming a friendship. That's what would happen. I didn't convert anybody. They saw the light and converted themselves. So thank you for bringing him up, Lorna. There's actually a whole documentary, that's called Accidental Courtesy, Daryl Davis, Race and America. So again, he's a really stellar example about somebody who, again, was just grounded in humanity and belonging. He didn't want to exclude these KKK members from his scope of concern, and was willing to go to that very courageous place of sitting down with them and getting to know them. I mean, outrageous when you think about it. It's pretty outrageous. Yes, please.
Maybe in addition to practicing the 3 C's, there's also an element of detachment around bias.
Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Just that you have to detach from your own biasness
In order to
consciously, in order to be open and curious and compassionate.
Absolutely. What's your name, by the way?
Cecilia.
Cecilia. Thank you, Cecilia, for bringing that up. I think that's really important. Once more, if we're too grounded in what we believe, our point of view, well, then there's not much wiggle room, right? We're not going to be able to actually create the optimal connection with another person. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Anyone else, anything to share? Shayla has something online. Why don't we unmute, and then we'll go to Mark here in the Gompa. Go ahead, Shayla. Oh, you're not.
There we go.
There you
Sorry.
go.
For me, I have to look at the labels that I'm using, and then look at the emotions that that label evokes, and then separate from the person, place, or thing, that label and those emotions. So that helps me. I'm not saying I'm great at it, but I'm working on it.
No, that is good, because we do, again, have a lot of these labels, judgments, things that we put on another person. Can we, separate from some of that to some degree? Because those things do evoke, as you said, Shayla, some other meaning, some other layers of stuff that we are going to be influenced by to see them perhaps in a negative light. Yeah, Mark, let's see what question or comment you have.
As you know, I'm not all that much of a fan of considering us all in search of happiness, but I do something a little different. I think that there's something holy about being a sentient being. There's something holy about the struggle, about the Buddha nature, and if I can, I think of that when I want to have some compassion and acceptance for someone who ordinarily I would not, even if it's a wasp or some simple thing where I'm in danger.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I think it's what John Powell called divinity earlier, seeing the divinity of another being, seeing the sacredness of another being, the Buddha nature, all these different terms that we have where that can be a very grounding point to come to see others and to acknowledge their preciousness, their sacredness. So thank you for sharing that. These are all great ideas. Again, I have no monopoly at all whatsoever on the whole idea of bridging. But whatever you might have found useful, certainly, if anyone else has anything they'd like to share, I would love to hear it. And I'm sure others would too. Let me just share one or two more things before we close, because we're really, I'm not wanting to keep people here too long, especially we've got a little gathering for Venerable Shanka to celebrate his ordination. I'm going to mention these folks, Arno Mikolas and Pardeep Kaleka. You certainly will recall what's the name of the synagogue in Wisconsin where there was the horrible shooting. Why am I not thinking of it? I'm sure it's here. Anyway, they befriended each other. One of them, the man on the left there, Arno Mikolas, he was a former member of a white supremacist organization, the one that actually was involved in. No, it's not the Jewish synagogue. It's the Sikh temple. I'm sorry, Sikh temple that was in Wisconsin. It's River of Life. I think that's the organization in Pennsylvania. There's so many of these incidents, we start to lose track of them, right? It's unfortunate. But essentially, these two befriended each other. And at that time, of course, Arno had already begun to move away from his white supremacist views. But Pardeep had lost his father in that shooting at the Sikh temple. And essentially, the two of them came together and formed an organization called Serve to Unite. And it takes a lot of courage to go past that. Another one involving the KKK. There was a KKK leader, C.P. Ellis, who befriended Ann Atwater, a civil rights activist. And they founded their friendship on the basis of a school program in Durham, North Carolina called Save Our Schools. So again, people that step outside of the box and decide I'm going to get to know someone on the other side and come to see them as a human being. Their story is quite nice. A local organization here in Santa Fe called Tomorrow's Women. Some of you may be familiar with them. They're located down on what street is that? Near Guadalupe there, Montezuma. They train and support Palestinian, Israeli, and American women to become strong, compassionate leaders by bringing them together. One of the things they do annually is bring people here, especially young women from Palestine and Israel, to get to know each other, to understand each other's points of view, to reinforce the idea of getting past, again, these labels and what have you that define people incorrectly. Father Gregory Boyle, who I mentioned earlier, founder of Homeboy Industries, largest and most successful gang rehabilitation and reentry program in the world. He's done amazing things. Again, you can look them up online. I think they're well worth taking a look at. And then Arlie Russell Hochschild, she's the woman I mentioned earlier, so I don't need to say anything more about her. Additional resources I might mention, these will be again in the slides that I'll send there. There's again a number of organizations that have put out programs for how to work with bridging. Braver Angels has a program called Skills for Bridging the Divide. Greater Good Science Center, I mentioned earlier, has Bridging Differences. Interfaith America, which is a national organization that works around separation of church and state and other political issues involving faith. Bridge Builder Basics, and they also have another program called Skills for Bridging the Gap. And then the one I mentioned, Starts With Us, the 3 C's, which I liked because it was very condensable and easy to remember. It's kind of a nice way to work with some of the principles of bridging. So in conclusion, this is from John Powell, again, whose book I'm really enjoying. I think it's quite valuable. So while I caution against approaching bridging as a set of boxes to check, I believe the power of bridging itself is that it moves us away from technique and into a deeper way of considering relationships and the world, which of course I feel that's also resonating with Buddhism in terms of how we think about our fellow companions in this world and act accordingly. Bridging will not only help us to understand ourselves and each other better, but will also help us to be more engaged and open with ourselves and the world. Bridging helps us create the conditions to make better decisions about the world we want to create. Again, what was shared earlier, that is what we're doing simply creating the world we don't want, or is what we're doing creating the world we actually want to experience and to have for ourselves and others and future generations. Okay, I hope that's been useful. Let's do our dedication prayers. Again, if any of you have any other comments or questions, I'm going to hang around for a bit for the tea and that, so you can talk to me there as well. So we'll do this wonderful prayers for Master Shantideva, and Nancy will lead us in that.
May all beings everywhere,
plagued
plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity.
May there be
Timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. As
For as long as space remains,
for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world.
And we make dedications for the good health and long life of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and all of our other spiritual teachers in our tradition, as well as all other spiritual traditions, so we can continue to benefit from their guiding presence in this world. I also dedicate for the very swift return of Lama Zopa Rinpoche. Most of you know his reincarnation has happened, but we have not yet identified the young child that is the reincarnation. And of course, we want everything to be auspicious for him to be able to benefit others in this new existence in the equal and even more powerful way than he did in his prior life. We can dedicate as well for all the beings we're holding in our hearts, those who we know directly, as well as those who we are thinking about at this time, parts of the world where there's great suffering. Wishing them to be free from their suffering and to find the happiness they seek. And may all beings have these same results through what we've done together here today. Thank you all. And again, I hope that something I've given you is something you can use in your life to build bridges with others who are different and to heal some of the divisiveness we do have in our world. So